So welcome everyone to AAUW of Oregon's session on artificial intelligence, rising to meet the challenge of generative AI with Professor Inara Scott. Just a brief bio of Professor Scott. Inara Scott is the Gomo Family Professor and Senior Associate Dean in the College of Business at Oregon State University. In her role as Senior Associate Dean, she manages and oversees the academic leadership in the College of Business and oversees the achievement of the strategic mission and vision of the college. Inara's primary teaching and research areas at Oregon State include sustainable business, business law, and environmental law and regulation. Her research has appeared in numerous premier outlets, including the American Business Law Journal, Harvard Environmental Law Review, and the University of Pennsylvania Journal of Constitutional Law. She is the editor-in-chief of the American Business Law Journal. She is internationally known for her work on generative AI pedagogy and higher education, which is a bit what we're talking about today, and has been featured in outlets including NPR and Inside Higher Ed. Prior to coming to OSU, Inara practiced law for almost a decade. She received a JD summa cum laude from Lewis and Clark Law School and AB summa cum laude from Duke University. So we are so grateful to have you with us today, Professor Scott.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Always makes you laugh a little bit when someone reads a bio and you sound terribly pretentious, so thank you for welcoming me here today, and I'm delighted to get to talk to you all. And as I said, please feel free to make this very informal. If you have questions, you're welcome to unmute and ask them or raise a hand or whatever you're comfortable with. There's also a chat function, and if you want to write something into the chat, you're welcome to do that as well. So what I will be talking about, I'll spend a little time just talking about generative AI and what it is and how it works, because I think that's really important to do when we start talking about what are the challenges and potential limitations of it, or what are things that we need to be wary of and thinking about when we think about AI. The funny thing I was sharing before we started the webinar here, that I'm on a task force at the university related to robotics at OSU and the kind of the future of robotics. And I'm a professor of business law. I am not a tech person. My background includes no computer science or machine learning or robotics or anything like that. And yet I was talking to folks who are running the task force about using ChatGPT to help us analyze some interview data that we have. And these are professors of robotics and computer science at OSU. And they sort of cocked their heads at me and they said, "You could do that? Like it could do that sort of thing?" I said, "Yeah, I can do that." So I think the great thing about AI and kind of where we're at right now with generative AI in particular is that it's the great equalizer, because even folks who are very skilled in computer science may not know what all of the potentials are of the technology, because the technology is developing very quickly. In some ways, it's very highly specialized, and in some ways, it's not at all, and it's very accessible to folks like me. So I would encourage all of you, if you haven't already. I'm going to do a little Q&A in a second here to you to see what you all are up to. But I would encourage everybody to use it. I think it can be a wonderful tool to help us in our daily lives. So I'm going to talk a little bit about generative AI, what it is, how it works. And then I'm going to talk about biases, because I think that's an area that we all need to be really thoughtful about, kind of the ethics of AI and some of the challenges it poses. And then, because I'm a professor and I like to think and talk about what we should be teaching, and we're going to talk about some of the skills that are necessary in this AI assisted world and future, and how does that impact what we do at the university and what we should be teaching. So I first just want to actually ask you all, and you can do this in the chat if you're comfortable, or you can actually just unmute if you want to shout out. But I'm curious how many of you have actually used generative AI, have used Copilot, that's the Microsoft product, ChatGPT, that's the one that gets most of the press. And then there are a lot of other applications. There's one called Claude. There's kind of a variety. You might have heard of DALL-E, which is an image generator. So I'm curious what your experience of generative AI might be. So if you want to put that in the chat, or if anybody wants to unmute and share, I'd be interested to hear.
Well, I'll unmute and share. Just I am so fascinated with this and have done a little overview for my local AAUW branch. And so at that Valentine's Day, I created a Valentine out of what did I decide? It was Copilot. The Microsoft has a little image generation thing. So I created a little bunny and some flowers and made that into a Valentine card that I sent out. And I use the Gemini, the Google featured for instead of just doing Google search. So when I want to know how to do something, I just pull up Gemini and ask it, and it gives me, step by step. Sometimes it doesn't know what I'm talking about, but I'll just ask it again or give it more information, and it'll give me step by step, do this, do this, do this, do this. And it's so much easier than doing a search on Google and trying to figure out from all of the things, what year is this one from, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I've done.
That's great. That's great. Well, it sounds like other folks who wrote into the chat noted that most haven't used generative AI per se. We had one question about whether Alexa counts. Alexa is definitely a type of AI. And in fact, as I said that out loud, my speaker bumped and said, "Did you need something?" Because Alexa's just there waiting for me. And Canva is another tool. It's a graphic design tool, but has AI capabilities now in it. So a lot of the standard applications that you all are using have AI embedded in them because all of you probably use Google to search. There is AI in that algorithm that returns you back an answer when you search. If you use your on your phone, if you've ever used Siri, of course, Siri is an AI tool. If you've ever done a text message and had it, or an email, or used Microsoft Word and it suggests how to end a sentence, it does that predictive thing while you're typing, and then it tells you, here's how you might want to finish your sentence. All of that are just examples of AI. So I really think about AI, and it's very broad. It is just a way that we use technology, and particularly generative AI is just a tool that helps create things, right? That respond to an environment in some way. So they're responding to some kind of a request. They're responding to information, and they are built in a particular way. And so we'll talk about that. But yeah, you're all probably using it more than you think you are. I'm going to encourage you all to try using ChatGPT, and I'm actually going to do a quick demo here. I don't usually do this, but we have such a nice small group. I'm going to do that just so that you can see something really fun. So I'm going to share with you my ChatGPT application. So ChatGPT has a free it has a free version, and then there's a paid version. This is the paid version, but I can just switch over into the free one if I want to. So there are different versions of it. So if I go to 3.5, that's the free version. And this is what it looks like. So you could just get a free account and you could go on here. One of the first things that I started using ChatGPT for was actually for recipes. So I might tell it something like, I have some tortillas, romaine lettuce. What else do I have in the fridge? I think I have a green pepper and some canned, I'm going to give it something crazy, some canned coconut milk. Can you create a recipe for dinner? All right, spelling errors and all. Of course it can help me out. So here's just an example of something ChatGPT can do. If you, when you I really do this all the time. I have 3 random ingredients in my fridge and I ask it to make me a recipe. So this is just an example. So you can see a little bit about the interface here. I gave it a prompt, just like a question. That question can be just about anything. And there's a whole science to how you ask questions to it. But then it comes back with a response, and you saw it's very fast. And it gives me all the ingredients, right? It's going to tell me how to do this, and it's going to tell me how to make something. So that's just an example. So you can see some of in the sidebar over here, you can see some of the things that I've had to do today. Very high powered work that I'm doing. I couldn't remember whether you capitalized that in a title. And so it will look up, it can look up punctuation for you. It can tell you just about anything that you want. So that's just a little show and tell about what is ChatGPT that you might have heard people talking about, and why is it become so valuable? And just try to get a little bit of an idea. Now imagine that you are, let's say, a student, and you're about to walk into a class about a book that you haven't read, and so you type into the prompt bar and you say, please tell me what the main themes are from To Kill a Mockingbird, and it's of course going to be able to tell you all about To Kill a Mockingbird. So it is very useful. And some folks might look at that and say, well, that student is cheating. Other folks might look at that and say, wow, that's a really helpful tutor. Let's say that you have a student who's really struggling with long division. There's actually built into ChatGPT the ability to have a back and forth conversation to say, I don't really understand long division. Can you give me some problems to work on? And then explain to me what the mistakes that I'm making are, and how I might be able to do better. So it actually provides this opportunity for students to be able to have a free tutor, which is pretty remarkable. Let me start my screen again. So of course, as long as people feel concerned about the technology or aren't sure if it's ethical or not, they're going to be really reluctant to use it. And like so many types of technology, it is changing so fast that it can feel very intimidating. And you just sort of feel like, I'll just wait until the dust settles, and then I'll start getting involved, and then I'll start using it. And no, of course, there's no imperative to use it. But I find it can be so useful that I just like to encourage folks to give it a shot. So let's talk about how it works and what it's doing. So generative AI tools like ChatGPT are trained on large data sets of content. So you can imagine that somebody just took the entire internet and just dumped it into a language model. And there's something like 17 billion inputs into the database that we were looking at there. So they're trained on these huge content sets. And what they're actually doing is not really understanding the content. So it's not that the machine actually knows and understands deeply, the science of cooking. What the machine knows and can do very, very well is, based on what it's seen in the past, it can predict how to put words together in a way that people seem to use, right? So it's sort of taking information, and then it actually builds out sentences, one word and one phrase at a time. And it's trying to predict, when you put this word down, what's the most likely next word to come after that, and after that, and after that. And it's generating content based on all of the other stuff that it's seen. What's the most likely useful way to respond? So it's training, but it's not really understanding. It is a predictive text model in a really, really large format. Okay, so this is very complicated, and you can see this is how these models are trained. So what they do is they're going to be giving them this huge data set of information, and then the machine is going to have to be given external sort of stimuli to say, this is right and this is wrong, as it's learning from all of the stuff in its database. And if you like memes, there's a lot of fun ones out there. You can look for potato or pit bull. There's, there's a bunch of other ones, but the challenge for the computer, right, is trying to distinguish, and it's really easy to see with images. Humanity is very complicated. We have a lot going on, and it's really hard to tell one thing from another. And so just like it's going to have to learn to distinguish which of these pictures is a doodle and which is fried chicken, it's making the same kind of judgments about language from all of the sources that it's reading. So it's reading text and learning and trying to figure out and interpret from that, oh, when I see this, then it means that. So it's drawing these conclusions based on the text that it has. So when you're using one of these things and it's generating information, what it's really doing, if you want to think about it in kind of the biggest possible sense, is it's crowdsourcing. It is looking at a question, and then it's going to look through its whole database of information, which is based on all these billions of inputs. And it's going to say, what's the most likely answer to that question? Or what's the most likely useful way that humans would want me to respond to that? So this is an example right here. And again, I find with images, it's easier to understand how this is working. This is from about 8 months ago. I asked one of the image generators called DALL-E, and it's actually DALL-E is now integrated into ChatGPT. But I asked DALL-E to create an image for me of a professor with a group of students. And I didn't give it a lot of information other than that, just to generate an image for me of a professor surrounded by a group of students. And this is what it came up with. You can see it's a little creepy and weird, right? DALL-E was, if you wanted to tell if something was generated by DALL-E, you could always look at the hands. So if you look at how weird these hands are, that was sort of a tell. DALL-E was not very good at generating hands. You can see the faces are a little alien-like. But if you just look really quickly, it looks like a professor talking to a group of students. But what you notice right away is, of course, what's the race of the professor? He's white. What's his gender? Looks like a man. What's the race of the students? Besides being alien, they sort of look white. They look, around a certain age. And so it's giving us the most likely outcome of the response to that prompt. What's the most likely professor? It's a white man. What's the most likely college student? It's a white, youngish student. That doesn't mean that that's actually the most likely, right? It's not actually assessing the data. What it's actually doing is it's looking at its database and saying, when people talk about professors in all of this language that I'm seeing, are they most often men? Are they most often white? Yes, and yes. And so that's what I'm going to do. So it is actually just replicating existing biases that already are present in our society because it is built from what we have created. It's also not necessarily just built from what we have created, but it's built from largely English texts. So stuff that's written in the English language dominates ChatGPT's training stuff. And it is largely Western focused. So there's been a lot of efforts to try to diversify and give it different stuff to look at, but still the percentage of the training databases that are in English and come from Western sources is very large proportion of what it's looking at. So based on that, you can imagine when you ask it a question, if you have 9 out of 10 of the things that it's looking at were generated by white people talking in English, then probably its answer is going to come in a way that reflects the biases of that culture. So that's a really important limitation to just keep in mind with any of these large language models. They are very flexible. And in fact, most of them can speak and read in hundreds of different languages. But their training data sets are still very much leaning towards Western culture. They're not very good at understanding other cultures, at reflecting other cultures, or reflecting diversity when they respond. Now, it's gotten a lot better. So this is the same program. This is DALL-E. And I asked it the same question about, I think this is about 6 weeks ago now, or maybe 2 months ago. I asked it to create an image of a college classroom with a professor and a group of students. So remember, that was the same question I asked, and I used to get this. Now I get this. It's different, right? I mean, the image quality is better. It's you can prompt it in different ways, so it has actually a lot more capability. So I could tell it generate a photo quality. I could tell it generate impressionistic art. I could give it a lot of different kinds of descriptors. But of course, who's teaching now? Well, it's a woman. She looks white. Who are the students? There's a much greater diversity among the students. I did the same thing again, and then it gave me this. I love looking at these images because they're so kooky. So look at this poor student. I think those are her legs over there, or those might be the legs that are supposed to go to this student who doesn't have a torso. I'm not really sure what's happening there, but you can see some really interesting things reflected in this, right? First of all, we have, in universities, we talk a lot about the sage on the stage. That was always how we described professors, and as being, the one who stood up and lectured, which, by the way, we're trying to get away from. But this is kind of literally a sage on a stage. I mean, for some reason, they've put this professor on top of this random small bookcase. You've got some really interesting stuff going on in the background with these pictures, these world maps. So clearly, the people who are making the generative AI products have changed the algorithm. So what is an algorithm? An algorithm is just a series of commands. It just tells how to operate. It's telling the computer, when this happens, then this should happen. And so this, and of course, algorithms are very complicated, right? But somebody changed the algorithm, OpenAI, which owns DALL-E, changed the algorithm. So instead of giving us students that look like this, now we see students that look like this. Right? The database didn't really change. The algorithm for what kind of results would come back did change. And so this is reflecting a couple of things. One is that the people who are controlling the generative AI tools have an enormous amount of power to shape the world as our students, and we are going to see it because we're going to ask these questions to these devices, and they're going to come back with an answer. This is just an illustration, but imagine, instead of asking it to draw a picture, imagine that you asked it, what's the danger to people from eating too much meat? Or, I got my cholesterol was high in my last reading. What are some ways I can reduce cholesterol? Okay. It's pretty important that these questions have good answers to them, because people are going to start asking health related questions all the time to LLMs. What happens when the answer that comes back is geared towards men? There's very different health outcomes for men and for women, right? And we know that our medical literature doesn't always reflect that, because it's often geared towards men, or studies are done on men. But how are the LLMs, these large language models like ChatGPT, how are they going to respond to the kind of questions that they get? So we can see some of the challenges in pictures, but you can think about the same challenge is happening for the device when it gets a question, something else. So when we think about these tools being embedded across all of our jobs and all of our devices, so Microsoft recently rolled out Copilot. Copilot is generative AI that is now embedded across all of Microsoft's applications. So if you use Microsoft Word, if you ever use Excel, if you ever use Teams, but eventually this is going to get incorporated all across Google, Google Docs, Google Workplaces. So all of our online applications are going to have some type of generative AI built into them if they don't already. And all of our workplaces are going to have some type of AI embedded in them if they don't already. So I mentioned my son works for a nursery. You can imagine that the owner of the nursery is probably using AI to help them rotate crops, figure out how the irrigation system should work, when should I water this versus this. And at some point, my son's probably going to walk around with his phone in his hand and somebody says, hey, I've got this plant. I live in zone 7. I'm looking for a great shrub that'll thrive. I have, clay-like soil. It's slightly acidic. What would be a great choice of plant? He probably has a good answer in his head, but, eventually we're all just going to ask the AI. So if you think about AI being embedded across all of our jobs, all of our workplaces, what does that look like as we're trying to decide what are the skills that we need in the future? And this is something that keeps me up at night because I want to know, I have to figure out what we should be teaching students. And that's really challenging. That's really hard to know. How do we equip them to work in that world? How do we make sure that they still are able to do essential things? But at the same time, how do we also make sure that they are going to have the knowledge that they need to be able to question the AI, right? So these are the things that I've identified as essential skills going forward. Much less is going to need to be stored up in your brain. So already, I'm sure if you have, if young people or kids or, you have grandkids, maybe, they're not memorizing stuff the way that you probably did. And they don't have to. They have a computer in their pocket, right? You have a computer in your pocket all the time. My daughter's in nursing school and they do still make them. You may be glad to know they do still make them actually do things without computers. But I also think, I'd actually rather if my doctor is prescribing a medication for me, that they not only use what's up here, but that they double check it with the computer. I'm actually totally fine with that because, there's a certain amount of reliability that comes from the computer. So much less of what we're doing in the future is probably going to require recall. And much more so, we're just going to need really good skills in terms of thinking, critically analyzing information, problem solving, team building, more and more. Again, this may be something that you see in young people that you work with or in, people in your family. But as we watch students go up through the university, the younger students don't meet face to face with their friends as much as they used to. It's unnerving, actually, how much less social interaction they have face to face and how much less social interaction they have, period. Much of their social interaction is one way. It's asynchronous. It's with social media. It's not with a friend. So you can imagine that has a real impact on their ability to work in teams. So this is a real challenge for us at the university, is trying to figure out how do we teach students to work in teams? How do we get them to engage in problem solving together? How do we get them to engage in relationship building and communication? Those are all really essential skills that they're going to need in the future that they don't necessarily have built in the way that they might have in the past. And then there's a few things that are really specific to AI that our students are going to need. So one of them is actually just dealing with this bias issue of being able to think through, okay, I'm getting that response, but that response is probably shaped by this existing bias. And so I need to be aware of that when I look at that information. So if I'm a medical professional, I need to know, okay, the AI gave me this response, but I actually know most of those medical studies were done on young white men. And so for the, person of color who's here in front of me, for a younger person, for a woman, those results may not be actually as applicable. And I may have to look differently at it or dig a little deeper or ask a slightly different question. So that's a really essential skill. And then the ability to critically assess the output. So you may have heard, if you've heard anything about generative AI, sometimes it makes things up. So it's not as bad as it used to be. It used to be much worse with this. But if I went at one point to into ChatGPT and I asked it to create a bio for Inara Scott, and it was really funny because I think what it might have done. So I'm a Professor Scott. My dad is also Professor Scott. My dad was a computer science professor at the University of Buffalo. And so it actually somehow merged us together. So when I asked for a bio for Inara Scott, it came back and it sort of described me, but then it said that I had gone to Cornell University and I taught at the University of Buffalo, both of which things are true about my dad and not true about me. So even though it wouldn't have known, and I don't know how it connected me and all of the other Professor Scotts out there to my dad, but it did somehow, which is also one of those slightly unnerving but fascinating things. Right? So how do you critically assess AI output? You have to look at it and know that might be true and that actually might not be true. And we also saw this, students were using it a lot to generate references or to get, kind of reading lists or article citations, and it would just make up the article citation. So if we go back to thinking about how it worked, that predictive text thing where it would be like, if I see Journal of Legal Business Studies, then most of the time when I see Journal of Legal Business Studies, I see a number after it. And usually, here's a very common number I see, 391. So it's giving you what looks like a really normal reference, but it's actually just made up based on this weird crowdsourcing predictive text thing that it does. So our librarians at the university actually had to put up new pages on the university website to say, ChatGPT makes things up, and that citation that you have may not actually exist, because they were getting all of these requests from students to find them these articles that ChatGPT was coming up with, which were totally false. They just didn't exist at all. So they had to be teaching students, hey, just because it comes out of ChatGPT doesn't mean it's real, doesn't mean it actually exists. Like I said, it's actually a little better at that now, but that's still a concern that the AI does make things up. I was recently using it to help me develop a reading list for a new class that I'm going to be teaching. And I would ask it, like, can you give me some suggestions for readings on globalization and capitalism? And it would come up with this long list of stuff. And then I would go in and I would copy it, and then I would put it into a search engine, and then I would actually look for the original source. Probably I would say, 95% of what it gave me was a real source, but 5% was made up or, similar, but not actually out there. So you really have to be able to critically assess it. So this is something that's really important for our students today. And then a piece that we worry a lot about is innovative leaps. And we think about how, again, the technology is crowdsourcing. It's sort of predictive texting. And imagine that you are trying to be innovative. Let's say that you're a business that's coming up with a new product, or you are trying to figure out a solution for some kind of a building challenge. Think about any of the challenges, stuff related to climate change. Many times what you need is not what's most likely. It's something that's innovative and actually totally different from what has come in the past. And it's not going to be good at that because that's not what it does. It does not innovate, it crowdsources. So you could ask it to innovate, but unless you give it really clear instructions about what you want, it's not going to be able to do it. So the ability to make innovative leaps and to kind of change the paradigm, AI is not going to be good at. So we need to figure out some way to keep that alive in ourselves. Just a couple of, let me pause for just a second here because I've been talking for a long time. Does anybody have any questions about how the technology works? Kind of what are some of the common challenges that we're seeing, or some of the key skills that we're teaching our students? Let's give it a second here. Yeah, Rhonda.
Rhonda, I have a couple of questions. Yeah. How do you get it? How do you download it, or whatever you do to it?
Mm-hmm.
If I say to it, should I vote for X or should I vote for Y? With the people of today, real people, names, how is it going to find me an answer? And I had a third one, but it's left me.
Those are excellent questions. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to open it back up again, and we'll do this together. So if you go to openai.com, this is OpenAI is the name of the company that runs ChatGPT, that owns ChatGPT. So you can just go to ChatGPT and try it. Now it's going to take me to mine because I already have an account. But if you do that, then it'll take you to be able to create a free account. So that's how you get started with it. And then let's see what it does. Who should I vote for president? Let's see what it responds. So it gives us a nice, very polite answer. So for those who can't read it, it's saying, as an AI language model, I don't have personal opinions or preferences, and I cannot offer personalized political advice. Additionally, I don't have access to real-time information about candidates or their platforms beyond my last training data, which goes up to January 2022. This is in the free version, by the way. If you if you had a paid account, it actually has real-time internet access. My dog is making noise in the background, and hopefully you can't hear it. So, interestingly, there have been some studies on the platform that have shown that it tends to get to know the people who use it. So it actually responds to the type of person that's using it. It provides a slightly different response to, and if it perceives them to be more conservative, it will actually give them slightly more conservative responses, for example. Or if it perceives them to be more liberal, it will give them slightly more liberal responses. Not in a very dramatic sort of way. These are small effects, but it does, they have been able to find small effects like that. So interestingly, you can ask it questions. So I teach about capitalism, and one of the questions I've played around with asking it is something. I think I might have. Let me see if I still have the slide in this deck. I asked it at one point about capitalism and white supremacy. So I asked it here, is capitalism linked to white supremacy? And it came back with an answer that says, the question of whether capitalism is linked to white supremacy is complex and multifaceted. And here are some key perspectives. Talked about the history of colonialism and slavery as systems that were racist and exploitative. Talked about sort of other critical perspectives. But if you ask the question in a slightly different way, so if you asked the question, instead of asking, is capitalism linked to white supremacy, you could ask the question, how is capitalism separate from white supremacy? Or how is capitalism not linked to white supremacy? And you can get a sort of informed answer to that question as well. So by the way that I phrase my question, what are some policies that would keep immigrants out of the United States versus is immigration beneficial to the United States? Or how are some ways we can encourage immigrants to come to the United States? 3 different questions, all of which are going to give you a different perspective. So it's very much going to change depending on the types of questions that you ask. So it's a long answer to your question, but a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else want to ask a question? Yeah.
I do. I couldn't find my raise hand fast enough, but I'm just wondering, as I'm thinking of about that, is there a way to use an AI apps without, say, setting up an account, so it doesn't give you results that are skewed to what it thinks you want?
Mm-hmm. So it depends a little bit on what you have access to. So if you signed up for a ChatGPT 3.5 account, it's not really going to get to know you particularly. It's not going to save your history of chats. It may save some of the information as training data that it will use later, but not attached to you in particular. Now, when you travel around the internet, there's little things called cookies, which are sort of, it remembers where you've been. And so you're kind of being tracked all the time. So I don't want to suggest that they can't figure out and personalize some of that stuff. But generally, particularly with some of these, like a free account, you're actually going to get less personalization than you would with a paid account. The other thing, so like what the university has now done is they've created a structure so that when we use Copilot, and all of our students and faculty can have access to Copilot, which is the Microsoft generative AI tool. It does not save any of the information, and it does not change the information based on who's asking it. So you can create these little closed universes for the generative AI in which it won't save the data and it won't kind of personalize the data particularly. But I think actually where the more of the personalization comes is in these very unconscious things we do when we ask questions that we just don't even really realize that we've done.
Good point. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else want to ask a question? Yeah. Miriam.
So is it really different from Googling a question?
Mm-hmm. So
especially when you gave us the recipe example, I Google for recipes that way, just going into Google.
Yep.
Go on.
Yeah, I think that the biggest difference would be if I Google something, it's going to give me a bunch of websites, and then I have to actually open up the websites and look at them and read them and process the information myself. So it's giving you a whole script.
Okay.
And it's also going to be able to, so for example, some of the ways that I use it, if I was to ask it, so I can do things with it like create a lesson plan for 2 weeks on globalization and capitalism. And it'll actually create like a whole 2-week lesson plan based on that. Now, I wouldn't, sort of use that per se, but it is capable of generating a much more complicated output than Google, which is just sort of responding with websites to a prompt.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And which is, of course, what makes people nervous about it, right? Is that it is providing such complete information that even more so that if I asked a health question to Google and I got back, a bunch of websites, I could say, well, that's the Mayo Clinic. They're a trusted resource. Oh, that's from, Dr. Tom. I don't know or trust Dr. Tom's advice. So I would be really, implicitly looking at how much I trust each of the websites that come up.
Okay.
Versus when you get it from a generative AI, you're just getting the output and you don't really know the sources that it was basing that on. You have to trust the algorithm is drawing on reliable sources. So it requires a much higher level of trust in the folks who created the algorithms that drive the output to it. Now they're actually the LLMs are now incredibly reliable in the sense that they pass a bar exam, they can pass like the boards for the neuroscience, exams, like their ability to respond correctly to standardized tests is incredibly high. So I think they are quite reliable, but certainly not 100% reliable. So we still need to be able to verify what we're getting out of them.
Inara, in thinking about that, can you then ask it, where did you get this information, or cite the sources of this information?
You can, but it's not very good at that. That's something it actually, so it only, when it responds to you, it has a certain amount of memory, and they call them tokens, which are the way that the memory is saved. it can save a certain amount of information based on its conversation with you, but it's not very much. So if I had like a back and forth conversation with it, by like the second or maybe third back and forth, it has totally forgotten what it told me before. So in the short term, maybe. And the other problem is it doesn't really know where it got its sources because it's all jumbled up together in this huge, whatever, 17 billion token database. And so when it is creating something, it's not necessarily creating it from a singular source. Now you can prompt it, and again, the websites are different. So if you go to Bing, for example, which is Microsoft's search engine, and you use Copilot with Bing, Copilot is their generative AI, it will actually draw in real time from the internet, and it'll both answer your question and give you links. So some of the tools, it'll be much clearer. And with ChatGPT, with the paid version, I can ask it to provide me with specific sources, but the free version does not. So it just varies a little bit.
I know that Gemini, which is the Google large language model, a month ago, it gave me links within the response. And then a couple of weeks later, I didn't see those, but it's got a little icon that I think I can click on and have it tell me where on the internet it got things. But that was a few weeks ago, so who knows what it looks like now.
Right. And Gemini was doing some very weird things. And so they actually kind of had to do a lot of backtracking with Gemini. And I don't know what the latest is on it, but it was doing some super weird things that got Google in trouble for a little bit there. Let me just see if I had anything else I want to make sure that I cover, because we're getting towards the end of our time. So I talked a little bit about the challenge for the university being, what do we teach now? So if students don't have to memorize information, but they do have to be able to sort of get a read on something so that I can tell, like, oh, that seems like that might be made up, or, oh, that's an area of bias. I need to double check that outcome. We still need to teach our students some content. But what we at the university are really struggling with right now, and this is just there's not really an easy answer to this, is these are the way that I break it down for folks in terms of what we do still need to teach. But every discipline is very different in China and is struggling right now. So if you think about, what do I need to know about physics? What do I need to know about law? What do I need to know about literature? What do I need to know about, you could just go down the list, and they're all going to be different. Students are going to need some content, but it's really not clear what. And that's kind of a challenge going forward. I'll just give you some ideas, and you can think about how we're using this today. One of the things that has been challenging us, again, in higher education is, how do we know if students wrote something or if the AI wrote something? Because it can write a very nice essay, right? And so there are these AI detectors out there. There's one called Zero GPT. There's one called GPT Zero. They're not very good. They're the AI detectors are not very good, and so and they actually were biased against English language learners. So if English was not your first language, these AI detectors tended to pick you up and say that you were cheating more than they would other students, even when you weren't. So we try to be really careful not to use them to, sort of, accuse or convict students of cheating. But it's actually very helpful for our students to check themselves. And what I have found, and what you may find in the future, is, say you're sitting and you're reading an email, and for some reason, it's just the most boring series of words you've ever heard. Like, you can't quite make yourself focus on it. I find myself having this experience sometimes. Like, this all just sounds like blah, 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 blah. That very often is an AI generated thing because it is so generic. It has taken all of the sort of innate voice that the author would normally have out of it because there is no author. And it makes it much actually less readable in kind of an interesting way. So I encourage my students to look at their text, because a lot of them are using it to help them write things. And then just make sure, if you're going to write something and turn it in, that you've actually edited it so that it no longer sounds like a computer. Because in fact, you are going to get less people to read and respond to you if they don't think that there's a real person behind that. And that's an interesting challenge that for business students, because I'm in the College of Business, how do we incorporate, let's say, into marketing, the ability to do this computer thing, but also at the same time, no, people actually don't like it. They can sort of tell when there's a chat bot on the other end, and they get pretty mad if you try to fake them out. So that's something that's kind of interesting that we're trying to do. We have students try different tools. So Marian, just like your question about, well, can I get it out of Google? Try it and see. We have them compare. So the goal is really just being to learn, what does it look like if I ask Bing this question? What does it look like if I ask Google this question? What does it look like if I ask ChatGPT this question? And that's a really nice trigger for them to see, oh, the algorithms are actually different in these different LLMs, and they're going to provide different results. And that is a good, reminder for me, like, hey, I got to be careful, because these things are not God, right? They don't actually think. They're just providing me a crowdsourced response. We actually are using, and my husband's also in K-12 education, and they're using this in K-12 as well, that they are using large language models as tutors to provide feedback to students, which is pretty cool. One of the persistent inequalities in education is that some students have an engaged mom or dad at home. My dad was a professor. He helped me with my math homework, right? I mean, I had access to a great teacher at home. Not every student does. And that just creates this really persistent inequity that some of our students are going to be much better prepared than others, just because they happen to live in the house with somebody who's a PhD in computer science. So this actually can help remove that inequity by giving students access to a tutor. Hey, I'm struggling with statistics. I got this question. This was my answer. It was wrong. What did I do wrong? Can you help me understand it? You can ask it, students can ask it, like, make 10 questions for me to answer, and then tell me if I got them right or wrong, and tell me what I did wrong. So it can actually test you. You can use it as like a prompt. So there's some real potential benefits there. And then another interesting thing that the AI can do now is that it can check its own biases. So, you can ask it for a question. So I used to ask it regularly to give me a list of top 10 jazz pianists, because I really like jazz, and or I would say top 20, top 10, and they were always all male. And this, was like the first 6 months or so that I would do this. And then finally, like, one woman popped on the list. So then I just asked it. I think I have a slide about this. Why is there only one woman on this list? Why do you think that is? And it actually had a really good response. Like, it had, well, there's, historical exclusion, there's gender bias, there's limited visibility, there's social and cultural norms, and all of those things play a part. I'm going to stop my share. My dogs are about to go crazy because my husband's coming home, so they're greeting him. So just in case you hear dogs barking in the background, that's...
This was really helpful. Come on, Linda.
Linda, go ahead and ask your question while her dogs are barking in the
Okay.
background.
I'm wondering, I'm sure you have been thinking about this for a long time, but how is this going to replace, is this going to set in, people are going to use this instead of as homeschooling, instead of buying curriculums or independent learning, and then, I don't know, or claiming they have proficiency in something. That's all. Do you have any sense of where it's going?
Oh, I'm sure it will. I'm sure that people will use it for homeschooling and developing curricula. Absolutely. I think those things are already happening. I'm sure that they'll happen even more. I mean, interestingly, there have been some efforts. Elon Musk is developing an LLM that would specifically, so he was specifically trying to design one that wouldn't give what he called like liberal responses. So he was trying to narrow the scope of the data that it was being fed so it would give back the kind of responses that his audiences wanted to hear. So that's kind of interesting. I think there's probably going to be more of that to come as well. You know, people already exist in bubbles, and I think it's sort of, you know, there's this potential to draw the walls around us. You know, I only want my students to see, or I only want my kids to see these, you know, types of books. So I create kind of a closed LLM that only have those kind of sources. So yeah, and I think that's going to be a real challenge for our society going forward. Yeah, Anne.
Human nature tends to be profit driven.
Mhm.
That leads to power and total control.
Mhm.
How is this going to happen in AI? Or is it already happening?
It is. It's absolutely already happening. And OpenAI, the company that operates ChatGPT, is a really interesting story. They were actually originally supposed to be nonprofit, and they were supposed to be open. So it was supposed to be OpenAI, right? And then they created this, you know, they sort of sectioned off the part of the company that operates ChatGPT so that they could operate for profit. And then the story kind of spiraled from there. So I think this is a real challenge, and I'm a lawyer, so this is informed by that. But to me, the answer to that is that there has to be really strong regulation to govern how the holders of the AI operate. And they actually just passed in the EU some really interesting legislation. I think it was maybe just yesterday or the day before. So there's been a lot of work in the EU to try to put some boundaries on what the companies are doing and to give more transparency in their data, in how they're, you know, kind of putting things together. So yeah, it's a real challenge. I think it's a real concern, and I think it's going to require regulation to try to address some of those concerns.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yep. Thank goodness it was a nice day outside, so I could just run onto my porch and shut the dogs in the house. So they're on the other side of the door now, barking. Anyone have a final question? I think we've come to the end of our time.
I have one more question. You've
Sure.
used generative AI interspersed with AI.
So
Is there a
what's the
difference?
difference? Yeah. So generative AI refers to these tools like the large. So if you, so I said a couple times large language models. So those are ones like ChatGPT that are actually generating. So generative AI just refers to the fact that it's creating something in response to these prompts that it's getting. So it is, it's been trained on large data sets, and then it creates music, videos, language, essays, you know, writing. That's what generative AI is. AI is any kind of tool where the machine is learning from some kind of a sort of a circular system where it is being fed information, it is taught how to respond to that, and then it gets some kind of correction, like this is right and this is wrong, this is a golden doodle, this is fried chicken. That's machine learning. That's kind of that process. AI is being is some kind of a tool, a technology tool that's being taught how to respond based on these series of algorithms and this training that it goes through. Then there's actually a totally different thing, which is general artificial intelligence. General artificial intelligence is what you and I might think of as sort of just artificial intelligence in the sense of something that actually can think like a human. So none of the the things that we've been talking about, the large language models, none of this generative stuff, Alexa, Google, none of that is general artificial intelligence. It's all just a computer that's been programmed to do a certain thing in response to a certain stimuli. But the sort of the next stage, where the sort of science fiction story is the general artificial intelligence, and that would be something that actually could think like a human. So right now, that does not exist. Thank goodness.
Thank you.
Sure. Well,
Any other questions?
yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, Professor Scott. And again, I'm going to say, I wish you were at the School of Business when I was there, because you really have helped us get a better understanding of what this is all about. When OpenAI came out last year with the big announcement and it became the big thing, ChatGPT became the big thing in all of our awareness. I know that especially in education, people were like, "Oh, yeah, we don't want this," and and I would say to people, "It's here. We've got to learn how to utilize and then teach our kids how to utilize this, and not just worry that they're going to use it to write papers. That's just that's over."
Right. Yeah. So I'm delighted. Yes, I agree, and I'm really glad that you all are interested in it, and I'm really happy to answer questions. And if you want to reach out to me, please do. I'm delighted to be a part of your community.
Thank you so much, Marion.
Yeah.
I wanted to see if I can get her email.
Yeah, just my first name, so you can see on the screen, Inara,
Right,
Inara.
right.
Last name, Scott, SCOTT, at oregonstate.edu.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. And you can also just find me on the College of Business website.
That's right.
Okay.
Great. All right. Well, everyone, enjoy the beautiful weather. I hear it's going to be here to stay for a little bit. So hope you all have a
Thank you
great
so
weekend.
much. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yep.